Hello. So now we are moving on and we are going to discuss Chapter 11, Personality.
In this chapter, we will define what personality is and describe its major features, e.g., enduring traits, characteristic pattern. Compare and contrast major theoretical perspectives on personality: psychodynamic, trait, humanistic, social cognitive, biological, and situational. Identify major theorists, e.g., Sigmund Freud, Carl Rogers, Gordon Allport, Hans Eysenck, Albert Bandura, and connect their ideas to modern personality research or everyday life. Apply one or more personality perspectives to contemporary examples, e.g., social media behavior, workplace traits, identity formation. Critically evaluate the strengths and limitations of different personality approaches, including applications like trait measures, job fit, genetic/biological underpinnings, cultural/contextual factors.
We're going to start with Module 11.1 and discuss psychodynamic perspective. So, you've heard throughout the semester we've talked about psychodynamic as well as psychoanalytic, and that Sigmund Freud is the father of the psychoanalytic theory. So now we're going to move into talking about, we looked at the stages, like the psychosexual stages in terms of development. Now we're going to look at the personality structure, which is a triad. And more or less, first and foremost, let's discuss what personality meant to Freud. Here, Freud felt that our personalities really is those psychological characteristics and behavioral patterns that is unique per individual and accounts for how we behave or act over a period of time. Again, Freud was considered a major theorist in terms of utilizing the psychoanalytic theory, where it holds that our personalities as well as our behavior is really shaped by our unconscious forces and the conflicts that we deal with. So, more or less, Freud's theory is really a complex theory in terms of how we look at the concepts. And there's four major concepts that you have to consider. That being levels of consciousness, the structure of the personality, the defense mechanisms that may be involved, as well as stages of psychosexual development that I talked about earlier. So, okay, let's go ahead and get to the nitty-gritty of Freud. Understand that there was three levels of consciousness that Freud felt we deal with. That being the conscious, and that's the part where we're in the present time of awareness, and that's the state we would be in. And then there's the pre-consciousness, and it's like that one level right below. You know how you might be daydreaming and you're here but you're not here. Well, that's that part of the mind that the contents is actually being brought up into the level of awareness through our attention, being focused on our attention. And of course, then Freud believed in the unconscious, that being it's the part of our mind that lays outside of our range of ordinary awareness. And more or less, it's wherever when we might be struggling with something, I've mentioned the term conflict, but things we might not want to contend with or deal with, our brain will push it down, repress it, and move it where it's beyond our reach, so to speak, because it's in our unconscious. But it's that part of the mind that's, again, outside of our range of ordinary awareness, where there's our impulses, our memories, those ideas, they're all there that can at one time or another possibly be brought up to consciousness. So now, more or less, I want to just say that Freud actually felt that within our minds, the unconscious, it's always a dominant force. and therefore usually we're not aware of some of our deepest wishes or deepest urges or ideas that we may have. It sometimes seems to be so much out of reach. Now, I love this particular graph because it gives you a clear idea of what Freud felt was when we're talking about our consciousness and where everything is at. And when we're talking about our personalities, I mentioned the term triad. Well, it's a triad of three entities that pretty much of where we are. And the iceberg is what you see. So on a conscious level, if you notice, there's not a whole lot showing. But there is where ego would reside. Um, and then you have the preconscious, and you see it's just a thin bar, meaning not too much is going to be held there. And then finally, the majority of the iceberg, or more or less in tentative when we're talking about a lot of the superego, although the superego may touch upon consciousness, it's also housed in our unconscious as well as the id. So we have the id, the ego, and the superego. And I'll talk about how they relate to one another, how they kind of interact in concert, so to speak, so that things make sense to you in the real world. So let's go ahead and break it down. As I mentioned, we have the id, the ego, and the superego. So now, more or less, I mentioned how they interact in concert with one another. This is where they're trying to keep balance. Your personality is, according to Freud, always working at trying to get what we desire. But sometimes we shouldn't always get the things that we want. We shouldn't always get instant gratification. But that's what our body will want us to do, and that's what our unconscious minds is going to be trying to do. Our id. Now the id is impulsive. Id, when I want something, I'm getting it. That's the attitude of id. Okay, and it's operating purely in the unconscious, and it follows what we call the pleasure principle, that instant gratification that I just mentioned. That's where it's looking at. So yeah, if you're Janet Jackson fans and you heard the song Pleasure Principle, it's a little weak replay of what I'm talking about on trying to get instant gratification. However, there's two other entities that try to help keep it from overdoing it. And that would be our ego, which works on the reality principle, meaning trying to keep us grounded, so to speak. And I call the ego the executive. It's the one in charge of trying to keep the id working at a correct pace rather than overdoing it. But then we also have the superego. Now, the superego is your moral compass. It's the part of telling both ego and id, look, we got to think things through. Is this right? Is this wrong? Should we do this? Should we not? That's what the superego would do. Okay, so id, think of impulsive, going after instant gratification, which is the pleasure principle. And then the ego, which I call the executive, but you can consider it to be part of the reality principle because it's going to always work toward keeping it grounded. But it also gets some support from the superego, which is that moral compass, or if you want to call it as on the slide, your moral guardian. It's like, think of, those visual aids you might see where you have an angel on one shoulder and you have the demon on the other shoulder. Think of it in that way. And what it is your head can be considered id. And then the angel is going to be more or less working toward, and it doesn't have to be a good or bad, but You just got two forces that's on your shoulders. One's going to be ego, one's going to be super ego, and they're going to be working in concert to kind of maintain balance, if that made sense. All right, so now, do you ever find yourself worried, anxious, concerned, but we do things to kind of help protect ourselves from those concerns or that anxiety or feeling down and out or angry? We might do things that's going to protect us. Well, that's what the ego is using, and it uses what we call defense mechanisms. And more or less, it helps us to prevent that anxiety from overflowing and building up to where we can't handle it. It takes care of those troubled desires as well as those memories that's within the unconscious, and sometimes it bubbles up and comes to our conscious awareness. You heard me mention earlier about repression. Repression is when we take the things we do not like or really don't want to think about again, and when we push it in to the unconscious. So it might be in your conscious, but say there's a traumatic event. Say you was in a car accident and you just don't want to remember. So repression is pushing it down. It's trying to help you to forget. This is one of the major defense mechanisms that's used by everybody. Okay. Other type of defense mechanisms is denial. We have reaction formation. We have rationalization, projection, sublimation, regression, and displacement. All right, so let me give you definitions. I'm listing these all out, but to help you to understand, like when we talk about denial, denial more or less is when we refuse to be able to accept reality or the facts to things. An example is a long time ago, I lost my brother. He was unfortunately murdered. And my sister in law, she called me, and it was like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning when I got the call. And she told me what happened. And I just refused to believe it. I was like, no, why are you lying to me? I mean, I literally cussed her out because I just felt, I was like, why would you play such a prank and do something like that to someone? But that was me with the defense mechanism of denial. And of course, I mentioned repression, so just to say it again, I try to forget what happened. When we talk about something on terms of reaction formation, what I'm talking about here is trying to express what's opposite of our true feelings to conceal them. So, like, say we might be angry at a teacher. Y'all might be angry with Dr. Kearns-Cooper. She's giving us some extra assignments, and but instead of saying the anger toward me, you give me accolades and you say things that's on a positive note instead of that negative note. So you're going to give me the opposite of what you're really feeling. That's reaction formation. Then we have what we call is rationalization. Here we're going to try to find all kind of logical reasons for the type of actions and behaviors we might be having, that's actually going to be motivated by unacceptable impulses. It's really it at work, okay? But we'll rationalize why we're doing the things we do, even though we know that what we're doing might not be of the best interest to us or to others. So that's what rationalization would be about. In terms of when we're talking about projection, here we're talking about how we might attribute our own unacceptable feelings or wishes and or urges and put it on another person. So think of it as, well, you are angry with yourself about running late or running behind or not being complete with an assignment, but you throw it back on me to say, well, if you didn't give me these type of assignments, I wouldn't have to worry about it being done. So I'm projecting my feelings about it onto you, even though it really had nothing to do with you that I didn't complete my assignments, right? Okay, so that's what projection would be. When we're talking about sublimation, here we're talking about how we might channel unacceptable drives, like our sexual or aggressive drives, and make it more socially acceptable or more constructive activities. So we're going to try to flip the script of it, so to speak. Now, one thing when we talk about regression, regression is just, again, not repression, but it's like us pulling back and trying to ignore what's there, but in a way of just floating it out and digressing, so to speak. It's like we'll get a more immature behavior about the situation and start, when you see somebody might be having a tantrum, we can say that they're regressing. Um, Displacement is kind of another thing in terms of how some might be, where we're looking at, how we might redirect our emotions or our impulses when we feel threatened, and try to put it more toward a safer target. One thing I didn't list on here, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. Well, it's not that let me be honest. These slides are something that's already created from us, from the publisher. So one thing they didn't put, but I'm going to mention anyway, is intellectualization. When we intellectualize, we kind of try to avoid emotional responses to some type of event by focusing more on the analytical or logical aspects of the situation, that's going to allow us to detach. So those were just some, okay? And I just want to point out again that, Freud felt that our repressed desires or our memories, they might bubble up and be revealed, and they come disguised, like within dreams or, slips of the tongue. So if you ever heard of a Freudian slip, that's when someone might say something that they really didn't mean for anybody to hear. So, where that's the slip of the tongue. You might have something negative to say about a person and you thought it, but you said it out loud, if that makes sense. So, that's just some parts of talking about uh, defense mechanisms. Excuse me. And one thing I do want to say, I know, and I moved the slide, I'm not going to go back, but just to say, our defense mechanisms are a good way to protect us. It's a part of our survival. However, you know that too much of a good thing is not good enough. Sometimes we mask too much and it makes us slip from reality. So that's something that Freud believed happens a lot of times with neurosis and anxiety. So that's something that we always, as clinicians, would want to be careful of. Now, I mentioned the psychosexual stages and development, and I'm not going to go deep into them again, but you do want to remember them, and know that Freud felt that, our psychosexual stages in terms of nature helps change how we seek out our pleasure, and that's through erogenous zones. Okay? Any conflicts we might have during these psychosexual stages will kind of develop how we handle things or deal with things. So, fixations, for example, would be those personality traits, or behavioral patterns that's going to come within a particular stage. Like, say, for example, if you smoke, based on Freud's theory, if you are a smoker, you might be dealing with oral fixations, meaning that during the oral stage, it wasn't satisfied for you. You didn't pass it or clear through it successfully. Therefore, you have to constantly have something in your mouth. Like, not only I said smokers, but here's a really good one: thumb suckers. if you ever notice, you have some individuals who start out as an infant sucking their thumb. Now, if they weren't able to transition to the next stage successfully, then they would keep sucking their thumb all the way up to adulthood. You have adults who still suck their thumb. That's what we'll call that fixation. Okay. So, with that being said, the oral stage is the first stage of psychosexual development. And again, like I said, the oral stimulation with sucking, the mouth, the biting, that's when we want, according to Freud, a sexual gratification orally. Yes, Freud was kind of stuck on the sexual component of it, but as we've seen with other theorists like Erickson and Horney and everybody else, they came up with other theories to kind of, because they didn't agree 100% with Freud. He made some good points, but then there were some things that, well, frankly, we felt Freud was dealing with his own neurosis. Now, the anal stage is the second stage in the psychosexual development, and it's dealing with, of course, the process of elimination or retention, release, or bowel movements. Basically, Freud felt that any fixations that we get here might have been because of too harsh or too lenient when a child is being potty trained. Sometimes children, when they're potty trained too early, they can be considered uh, anal retentive. Or you have some that's going to be where they're anal expulsive, and that's the ones that, okay, they didn't get as much guidance with potty training, so it was really lackadaisical for them. Therefore, there's it's like, they might be sloppy, they might not be, the best at keeping clean, and those type of things, or everything goes, over their heads. And that's where we're talking about in terms of either being anal retentive or anal expulsive. The phallic stage is the third stage of psychosexual development. And here we're looking at the erotic attention in terms of the genital region, that being the penis for boys or the clitoris for girls, and how the development of the Oedipus complex is formulated. And when we're talking about the Oedipus complex, what we're talking about is a term that's more or less Freud came to describe a boy's unconscious desire to love his mother, but also be a rival of the father. Okay. Now, what's not listed here, and I tell you, sometimes it's misogynistic, or sometimes it's where um, you see some gender bias into play, because the authors and publishers felt it necessary to discuss the Oedipus complex, but there's also what we call the Electra complex, which is when the girl develops an unconscious desire for her father and becomes jealous of the mother. So, going back to the Oedipus, again, the boy develops this unconscious desire, according to Freud, of mom. He's, he's a mama's boy, and the father's the rival, and it's like, no, get away. You ever see those reels they have where they'll show the babies interacting, and where it'll be um, the boys will want to protect their mom from their dad by pushing the dad away, or you'll have girl dads when we're talking about the Electra complex. So some of these type of behaviors, just to throw them out there, is where you'll have, because of either the Oedipus or Electra, a child may insist on sleeping between their parents to keep the parents apart. Or even when a child might declare that they want to marry their parent of that opposite sex. So it might be where the son say, I'm going to marry my mommy, or the daughter will marry her dad, or marry someone like dad as they get older. You also have where a child might become possessive of their parent, like I mentioned, or they'll argue and challenge parents of the same sex. So I have three sons. I love my sons. They're, grown ups now, but I also had the opportunity to raise a little girl for the first 5 years of her life. And if I had to choose again, it would be always me having boys because I got along great with the boys. But my stepdaughter or foster daughter, she was, we called her Baby Thug, okay, because she just wreaked havoc. She wreaked havoc with us all. But she was always oppositional and always challenging, but she never gave her uncle a problem. She was her uncle's best friend. So, but me as the mother, always oppositional. And the biggest times you could see us challenging one another was when I had to comb her hair. She really hated when I did that. So that was just some type of examples to talk about in terms of behaviors that we might see. And again, just to remind you, that would be during the phallic stage, which is the third stage of psychosexual development. Right. So let's pause the video for a moment, and it's time for you to do your attendance. Remember, your attendance must be taken on Monday, November 10th, 2025, and it has to be done no later than 11:59 p.m. Anything after that, you're considered absent. So please make sure you do scan the codes. Also, let me remind you, but today I already know it's going to be past 11, it's going to be past our classroom times. But on days that we're in class, please make sure that you are using the QR codes during our class time. And that's up to 9:06. After 9:06, the QR code is usually removed from scanning abilities. So please don't take pictures of it. You're supposed to be only scanning it. Um, and allow your fellow students to be responsible for themselves. Please do not send photos to people who are absent, because if it ever comes down to it, people will be reported for academic dishonesty, and y'all don't want that. I don't want to do that, and I know y'all don't want to do that. So please, just make sure you do the QR code yourselves. All right, so now we're gonna get back to the lecture. Thanks for listening. Now, see, they're kind of late, so I'm not going to repeat everything I've said, but here again on the slide, it now goes into a little bit more detail about the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex. Um, However, Freud also felt that boys might develop castration anxiety, and this is that unconscious fear of their penis being removed because of unacceptable sexual impulses. And then on that, top of that, penis envy, which is where girls, Freud felt, would experience penis envy because they say girls are inferior to boys, which we kind of know it's not the case, but that was Freud's way of thinking. Um, so those are two types of things you want to just keep in mind: is castration anxiety and penis envy. During the latency stage, that's the fourth stage of psychosexual development. Here we're looking at where impulses might remain latent or dormant, and they can be triggered. These are when I say latent or dormant, they're still within pre-conscious to unconscious. They're not within the conscious stage, but these sexual impulses are about to explode. Why? Because now we're approached puberty. Okay, so during pubescence, this is when a child is starting to recognize their attraction to the opposite sex or even the same sex, but they're finally recognizing sexual urges, and they're wanting to act on those urges, according to Freud. Now, in Freud's developmental, there's only 5 stages. So the fifth stage is the genital stage, and here is where we're talking about puberty getting into full effect, and then it moves on into more of a mature status in terms of developing sexually, and moving toward the process of procreation. So here we'll be talking about how the men, they grow, they get older, they go through puberty. Women, they go through pubescence, and they develop their menses, and body starts to changing to prepare for procreation. And more or less, that gives you an idea about, and there's so much more to talk about, but I just wanted to give you a little bit about psychoanalytic theory. So let's move on. All right, so now we're up to a knowledge check. And the question is, what is the correct order of Freud's stages of psychosexual development? And no, you don't have to put it in as a question because I gave you the question. I'm looking for an answer, but doesn't mean I'm going to not play my theme music. All right, so which one did you choose? Would it be A, genital, oral, anal, latency, phallic? Would it be B, genital, anal, phallic, oral, latency? Would it be C, oral, genital, phallic, anal, latency? Or would it be D, oral, anal, phallic, latency, or genital? And the answer would be D. Okay, and just remember there's 5 stages for the psychosexual development that starts with the oral stage, and that begins during infancy, and it moves all the way through where the anal's like between 2 to 3. Phallic would move into the 5, 6 years of age. um Latency is going to be more toward the 7 to 10, and then from 11 on, I would say on average would be about that genital. So let's keep moving. All right. So as I mentioned, with Freud's work, you had many people following him and learning from him. However, they didn't stay under him in terms of sticking to true to his belief systems. We have what we call neo-Freudians. And with neo-Freudians, here they didn't emphasize on all the sex and aggressive motivations like Freud did. Rather, instead, they came up with other areas to focus on that dealt with the ego, particularly with the development of ourselves. So, major neo-Freudians included Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, as well as Karen Horney. Now, with Jung, he put a lot of emphasis on looking at the present, not the past, like Freud did, and more on infantile or childhood experiences. He rather looked more at the conscious process instead of the unconscious, and looking at how we become aware and more directed, self-directed goals and how we handle that. Jung did think about us in terms of one's personal unconscious and how we have a collective unconscious. That being, it has primate images of what we call archetypes. And these are the different type of themes that might be reflected of what we experience in life and how we take them and absorb them in. And it's going to reflect more about our ancestral as well as universal type of experiences that we go through, meaning that some things nobody else will ever experience except me. But then there are certain things that we all experience. We all experience, for example, getting up, going to work, getting up, going to school. We all experience that. Now, how we handle it individually changes it from a collective unconscious to what's more personal. Okay? Now, with Adler, he looks more at individual psychology. He felt that human behavior, we needed to take more of a therapeutic approach that had an emphasis on social nature when we're dealing with people, as well as understanding that we have this desire to belong and to connect. So, more or less, what he felt was we strive towards superiority as well as power to be able to compensate for any type of feelings of inferiority that we might have. And he also expressed how unique we are as, you know, human beings. We're social beings as more than human beings is one of his key concepts in individual psychology, saying that we're born in a reciprocal type of relationship and we have fundamental desires to belong and to feel significant amongst one another. He also talked about compensation and that we strive for superiority as well as power, and we'll compensate our feelings of inferiority that might stem from family dynamics or physical conditions or even having a lack of social feeling or social interaction. In individual psychology, there's also looking at the lifestyle and how there's a uniqueness, and it's the product of our creativity that helps to serve as a reference point toward our attitudes, our behaviors, our worldviews, our self views. Then there's interdependence. This is where we might have people who are interdependent and there might have shame involved, particularly when asking for help, or it may be a sign of a more westernized philosophy in overemphasizing on independence. You then have what we call holism. And holism is where people are going to be better understood, not as in parts or compartmentalized, but in a whole. Um, and we are more than the collection of parts. Gestalt is another area that holism would reflect a lot upon. We'll talk about that later. Then there's the positive contributions. When we're talking about individual psychology, we're looking at how we can encourage one another to be able to make positive contributions to society as well as achieve our own personal happiness and contentment. So that's just some areas that, we talk about in individual psychology. I know I veered off from the slide, but in looking at the slide, excuse me, you want to point out that creative self, and that's the part of our personality that's going to be aware and try to organize our goals, so that we're significant in terms of how we interact with society. Again, know that there is something called the inferiority complex, and Atlas thought is we're influenced by inadequacies a lot of times. We're self-deprecating. How many times you've been able to put yourself down before you give yourself a compliment? Well, in Atlas' way of thinking, that's part of our inferiority complex. And then when we have these feelings of inferiority, there's really a drive or desire to kind of compensate for it. And that's where we're driven for superiority, according to Adler. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about Karen Horney. Okay, her ideas are centered on the idea that childhood experiences, especially the fulfillment of the need for safety and security, is considered to be the fundamental basis for a person's development. So, when needs are not met, children will develop what is called a basic anxiety. And more or less, Horney felt that a basic anxiety is where a person's need for safety and love in a childhood is extremely important. Being that this need isn't going to be met by caregivers is when it becomes problematic, and a child may develop a sense of helplessness or become insecure. And it's that basic anxiety that may lead to later neurotic behaviors. So, in terms of when we're talking about neurosis, neurotic needs are being able to cope with basic anxiety. And this is where people would develop a set of neurotic needs that may be excessive and rigid, but it demands for affection, approval, as well as a person or a partner, and power. And it's going to be this where needs that's not met, that are not healthy, then the coping mechanisms, they're going to override. Remember, I talked about defense mechanisms. Well, Horney felt that we had coping mechanisms that was similar in that effect, that we're going to try to protect ourselves, but sometimes it's not always successful. And that's when the neurosis runs rampant. Now, there are neurotic trends that Horney discussed, and these major trends are: one, moving toward people, and this is where we have this need for affection, approval, as well as dependency. Uh, we like to try to lead people, and you have a lot of people who are people pleasers. They have to make sure everybody feels great and feel good, even at the sacrifice of themselves. Then we have moving against people. Now, this is where it's more hostile and aggressive attitude toward others, and the view of their world is more competitive, and it's a hostile place, and it's where one is going to be more dominant they feel they have to be dominant in order to survive. The third one will be moving away from people. This is that need for isolation and detachment from others, and usually it's seen through withdrawing or from any kind of emotional involvement, or trying to seek out, self-sufficiency. So that's a component or a core concept of Horny theory. But you also have to look at the healthy versus neurotic personality in her theory. With healthy individuals, we're looking at how those three trends is more flexible and they're appropriate depending upon a particular situation or experience. Whereas a neurotic is more going to be, the people will be more compelled to be rigid, they're going to be compulsive, and they'll rely on maybe one trend more than the others. There's no balance. That would, of course, make it difficult for a person to adapt to any kind of new situations. Last thing I want to say about Horney's uh, theory is looking at a central inner conflict. Here we're talking about the struggle between having real healthy self and false self, which might build on the pride system, and it can be turned into a tyranny of shoulds, like rigid internalized demands. Oh, you should do this or you should do that. It's going to be that inner conflict that'll fuel self-hate. That's where that self-deprecation again comes from. And it's a continuation of that neurotic cycle that's really difficult to break. So, one of the things I'm going to point out, I already talked about the basic anxiety as well as basic hostility or aggression, but Horney also talked about how men may experience womb envy in terms of uh, physiological superiority of women, because women are able to produce life. Although men provide the sperm, women hold and maintain a life through the cycles for 40 weeks. Therefore, Horney felt that, well, just like Freud felt women had penis envy, and men have womb envy because they can't have children, not in the same way we do. All right, so in getting ready to wrap up about psychodynamic perspectives, it's still, even to this day, more detailed and comprehensive than many of the other theories. But it's always been criticized because of the lack early on of the empirical data. Freud was more toward the art of his theory than of the scientific. And he again relied more on the sexual and aggressive drives, um, instead of looking at social, interactions. So another thing, again, I already mentioned, is the evidence-based theories. It's not as heavily, now more so today, like psychodynamics is more heavily researched than psychoanalytic was when this first started. So that's how that would go. All right. So we're at the end of part one. Next, in terms of personality, we're going to look at the trait perspective. So, on that note, I hope that everybody did their attendance for the day. Have a great, wonderful day, and I hope to see you on Wednesday. Take care.